Zionist war criminals launch unprovoked attacks against Syria. The war criminals are at it again. Unprovoked, the Israeli government recently launched airstrikes against Syria, claiming that they were aimed at preventing Hezbollah, basically from gaining access to missiles, despite the fact that a substantial number of Syrian troops were killed in the strikes. The Israelis had claimed that they were not targeting the Syrian government. The airstrikes came shortly after the Israelis made claims with no concrete proof, stating that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons against its own people. It says this was parroted across the American media outlets, many of whom were touting it as if it were fact, just because the Israelis proclaimed it as such. So they go on here and it says, what sort of logic is this? If the Syrian government launched airstrikes killing dozens of Jews in Tel Aviv, the Zionist scum would be on American news outlets calling for a full-scale invasion of Syria and immediate United States military intervention. This act of war proves yet again that Israel is an illegitimate government run by a bunch of criminally insane psychopaths. And I'm sorry if the audio, I just noticed that it's really, really low, and I can't really do anything else on my end. I got everything, all the volume in that jacked up, microphones. With U.S. approval, Israel plans Syria escalation. This was covered almost exactly a month prior to this Israeli basically attack on Syria. Remember we were talking about this. New plan calls for ground invasion, occupation of buffer zone. So yeah, the last attack they got approval by the U.S. So again, this is probably what happened. And then of course you have in the media all the pundits going back and forth about Obama and the White House retracting their statements on the red line, this red line, crossing the red line. Having been given the green light not just for Wednesday's attacks but for other future attacks, Israel is now said to be planning a dramatic escalation. The new plan under consideration by its leadership calls not only for additional strikes inside Syria but a full-scale ground invasion across the Purple Line, seizing a 10-mile buffer zone on the other side of the line in which to install large numbers of Israeli troops and tanks. Syria says Israeli strikes coordinated with terrorists. Israeli strikes on Syrian Army targets show coordination with terrorists, including Al-Qaeda-linked militants, the Syrian Foreign Ministry said. I love how they always throw this in Western media, because most, I don't want to say most, but I would imagine most people that are reading this will fall for this little journalistic tool. I don't know what you would call it, but Syria's government refers to rebels fighting against it as terrorists. Ooh, as if they're not terrorists, because then if they were terrorists, then that means that Mr. Obama in the White House and the UK and Cameron and France, basically all of the Western Zionist-occupied countries would be supporting terror. And since they're fighting a war on terrorism, it wouldn't make much sense. The whole logic of fighting terrorism would break down. It's kind of like the protocols for the elders of Zion, saying that a document in court saying that, basically striking down, saying that it's not legit, that it's a forgery. Oh, well, it's a forgery. Well, then an original copy must exist. But people, these are these real weird little mind control techniques that are used just for basically ordinary people who don't have their guards up, their mental guards up. So Syria's foreign ministry said that it basically led to a lot of people dying, including civilians. This leaves no room for doubt. Israel is the beneficiary, the mover, and sometimes the executioner maybe of the terrorist acts which Syria is witnessing and which target it as a state and people directly or through its tools inside. Again, those tools would be the terrorists. Israel rushes to rescue Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria from May 5th, as expected as a result of sweeping gains by the Syrian Army all over Syria. Says here the failure of the sleeping cells in the coastal countryside to make any progress and throughout the northern countrysides. It was expected when these terrorists failed, their masters would come to the rescue, and it happened. In the dens of the night when Damascus citizens were sleeping, says here, that sources confirmed that it was an Israeli raid, but details are yet to come. Of course, we know what it is. So, people all over the city and the countryside heard explosions and felt tremors. Said a food supply center for the army, with all food needs from whatever chicken and all that, were killed. And Syrian Arab Army Air Defense Unit and the Army Weapons and Munition Depot. So far, they're looking for harmful materials that were dropped It says here Israel is infamous for using depleted uranium and cluster bombs in its raids, even at schools in Gaza. Most likely the same might have been used in these raids. It's interesting because their tools, the terrorists, actually carry out these bombings outside schools inside Syria, and that's another tactic that they use. It says Israel and its agents inside Syria must have felt very frustrated after their chemical weapons craze, that they try to blame on the government, was flushed and not built upon despite the systematic propaganda by mainstream media. Next up, we have former Syrian rebel chief, Islamists should be included. So it says here, the former Syrian National Coalition president, Mr. Moaz Khatib, who resigned, is critical of efforts to split the rebels into two camps, a moderate and an Islamist camp, and insists the Islamists should be included in the rebellion. It says, we refuse any radical thinking, but does not mean we cannot exclude, or we can exclude them. So, Israeli and Hezbollah-controlled enclaves take shape inside Syria. This is from Debka file. So just so you know, Syrian rebel forces continue to fall back this week against superior Syrian forces in the north, center, and south. Wednesday, May 8th, they lost the important town of this Kirbit Gazela. Also, it says here, for the first time in 2 months, the main transit route opened up for Syrian troops to reach the Jordanian border from Damascus. Said also in the opposition forces holding ground along the Syrian-Israeli border. It says on Tuesday, Assad was quoted as saying that Golan Heights will be the front line of resistance. It also goes on there, it says that Israeli army vehicles are crossing the line to evacuate wounded rebels in need of medical care. Now, we covered this, over a month ago. So this is coming from basically a pro-Israeli site. It also goes on here and it says that the arrangement suggests a kind of security zone that is evolving on the Israeli-Syrian border. Basically, they're recalling alliances between Israel and Christians of South Lebanon. Of course, you have Hezbollah and those types of sects with Syria. This is by pouring men into Syria. Hezbollah is gambling on Israel not taking advantage of its heavily diluted strength on home ground to strike Hezbollah strongholds in Lebanon or its supply routes from Syria. Both Hezbollah and Israel appear to be in the process of relocating their lines of confrontation from Lebanon to Syria. Israel's airstrike on Sunday, which hit Hezbollah and Iranian targets, may have been the first skirmish between them on Syrian territory. It is unlikely to be the last, so it's very important that their Free Syrian Army rebels defect to Islamist group al-Nusra, the well-resourced organization which is linked to Al-Qaeda, is luring many anti-Assad fighters away, says brigade commanders. So they're saying that the Free Syrian Army is losing fighters and capabilities to Al-Qaeda. So they're emerging as the best equipped, financed, and motivated force. So that's interesting. Well, who do you think they're being funded by? Western democracies. This is my website, Global Government News, ggnonline.com. I had to take a little break there, so I had no internet, and now I'm back. So I have a poll up here. Was the Israeli airstrikes against Syria a sign of Western desperation for regime change? And you can vote on that, or, you know, kind of a side question or hidden question would be, what is this just part of the plan, you know, on the road to Iran, right? The path to Persia. This is all part of the Brookings Institute policies, these private think tanks. You know, this has nothing to do with democracy, or this is the American people. Their consent is engineered. Their ideas are engineered for them up in these think tanks, and then they're disseminated through usually pro-Zionist media. Syria militants capture UN peacekeepers in Golan Heights. Again, this has already happened before. So militants fighting against the Syrian government have abducted a group of UN peacekeepers monitoring the ceasefire line between Syria and Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. So these were Filipinos, I believe. It says in March, anti-Syrian militants detained 21 Filipino peacekeepers in the same region. Next up, just like Iraq, U.S. arms butchers who use chemical weapons on civilians and then tries to frame someone else. It says UN investigator Carla Del Ponte said that there is strong evidence that the rebels used chemical weapons, but that there is not evidence that the government used such weapons. So it's not surprising. As Harass reported on March 24th, jihadist not Assad apparently behind reported chemical attack in Syria. So yeah, I mean, it's not just regular Zionist media. It's all kinds of media that like in that one article says they parrot these things. So even in, like, we just saw the Depka file article saying pretty close to the truth, and then you have this Haaretz, which is basically an Israeli news source. So, and there's even been people in the Israeli government saying that, well, we know based off our intelligence, along with the U.S., that the chemical weapons were not used by the Assad government, but they won't say that it was used by the terrorists or that it occurred at all. So remember that the American government gave chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein, which he then used on Iran and the Kurdish population. They attempted to blame Iran for a chemical weapons attack on the Iraq's Kurds, just as they're trying to blame the Syrian government for the attacks in Syria. Turkey sends team to screen for chemical weapons on Syria's border. Turkey has sent a team of 8 experts to the border with Syria to test wounded victims of the country's civil war for traces of chemical and biological weapons. So this is about as ridiculous as, what was this, British SAS going in there after the initial chemical attack by the terrorists, going in there looking for evidence. Were they trying to plant it? It's the same thing. Are they trying to plant it? Because we both know that, you know, the Turkish government, we all know that the Turkish government and the UK and all that are providing support, especially right now Jordan and Turkey, funding and arming these insurgents. Russia suspects international public relations PR propaganda to justify use of force in Syria intervention. It says there are signs that the international public opinion is being prepared, or engineered, right, for the possibility of intervention with force in the Syrian crisis, says Russia's foreign ministry. Moscow is concerned by the signs of preparing the public opinion in the world to the possibility of intervention using force in a lingering internal conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic. It says here, from our side, we persistently call to stop the politicizing of this exceptionally serious issue and the inflating of the anti-Syrian atmosphere. Why liberal hawks are pushing to strike Syria, says progressive columnists are asking, do the lessons of Iraq apply to Syria? So it goes in there and starts off with this Bill Keller in 2011. It says executive editor of New York Times offered a mea culpa for his support for the war in Iraq. When the troops went in, they had his blessing. They couldn't foresee how they would mishandle the war so badly, right? Because we all know that the mainstream media was basically a lapdog for the Bush regime, pressing for, you know, the Iraq war and that. So, but it goes in here and he says that basically we need to go back and have some costly wisdom of Iraq. What went wrong, right? But he says, but that shouldn't scare the White House from intervening in Syria, because the situations in Iraq and Syria are different. One of them being, it says here, in Iraq, our invasion unleashed a sectarian war, which is probably part of the plan. In Syria, it's already well underway. Well, see, that's because we don't have boots on the ground with American flag troops and, you know, where you can see them, and instead we're just actually funding terrorism to go in there as insurgents and create sectarian strife. Well then, you know, this is a good way to skew the truth. Which would make sense, because he said, what, third, we have options that do not include putting American troops on the ground. No, you just basically fund terrorists. You use proxy armies tools, right? I love what he says, though. First, we have a genuine imperial national interest. It's our national interest, right? Corporations, global corporations? No, it's the individual American, right? Not just a fabricated one, he writes. Says that they can't have a failed state located right next door to Israel. I like how they include it here, because basically what? All these, Jordan is playing a deadly game, Turkey is playing a deadly game, Iraq, I don't know how much they have, how much say they have, but they're trying to remain neutral, and Lebanon as well. It says here, but yeah, that's the whole thing about the hawks, the liberals, Obama, and stuff, but they're all silent right now with the drone strikes, what's going on in Syria. Kind of a small, very quiet buildup in Africa as well. And of course, you have kind of a mustering of forces, naval forces in the Pacific too. So, but it's all quiet. It's very shadowy, special forces and all that. And it doesn't get much media attention. You know, a lot of, like, the whole thing with North Korea. Well, North Korea helped U.S. Build up some forces out there aimed at China. Assad says Syria capable of confronting Israeli terrorism. Said the Syrian Army is capable of confronting the Zionist entity which represents terrorism against Damascus. So in regards to the Iranian foreign minister's quote, or what he was talking about, saying that there's a kind of this resistance axis against Israel in the West, says, God forbid, if there's any vacuum in Syria, these negative consequences will affect all countries. No one knows what will happen. This is what you could hear from both them and the West. So I guess I wanted to get all this in one video, but it's just so much, guys. I'm going to stop here, and we'll continue in part 2. We'll probably have like 4 parts today. This is GGN, and I'm Darko. Thank you.